Hello, thanks for checking out this video. My name is Zach, and we are reading a Western today. Yes, this channel is mostly science fiction and fantasy reviews, but I do read a little of everything else like comics, manga, business, personal development, and apparently Westerns. On the suggestions of Reddit and hearing this all the time on the internet, I did finally read the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. This book, I went into it with that kind of lofty expectations that this is a Pulitzer Prize winning novel. It's talked about on so many subreddits that I read about not just books, but also appears on Reddit's fantasy list of just general books that people love. Books like Lord of the Rings and Shogun and Lonesome Dove. So this is a book that, okay, I had to put on my radar and sort of see what all the fuss was about. And it is also a book that I read twice, in the sense I started it twice. So that's the kicker, is that I originally finally got the the audio book, the original one, which has an author that is a actor. So the voice sounds like a Western actor reading it. He has that really great, rusty kind of what you would expect stereotypically from a Western. And yeah, it just really grinds my gears, as they say, because the book does have a rather slow start. And hearing about the town of Lonesome Dove and people just sort of sitting around, yes, eating beans, and then to hear the narrator have this really raspy, sucking voice every couple words was very distracting. He very has a raspy breathing direct into the mic, which maybe at the time sounded great, but it really took me out of the immersion of the audiobook. It was not well produced, I guess you'd say, by modern standards. And then I heard that, yes, there was a new 50th anniversary edition of the book and audiobook that came out. And I put the hold, got the book finally after a little bit delay after it came out. And wow, yes, a huge improvement with Will Patton as the narrator of the new 40th anniversary edition of Lonesome Dove. And I was able to push through the slow start into the actual novel itself. So this is a huge novel as well, which is another deterrent that when I read the people talk about this, it's a pretty long book and it's a big commitment. It's like 36 hours of an audiobook. That is like Sanderson level of an audiobook. And it is a commitment to read Lonesome Dove. And it's one of those books where, as a fantasy reader, there is sort of a story, but there's not a big, like, save the world, save the princess type quest. We're not on this epic quest. It is all about a cattle drive, which again, on the surface doesn't sound that exciting. That this group of retired Texas Rangers and cowhands are going to drive cattle and sell them from Texas up into Montana. And that's the book. We're going on a quest. But if you look at also from maybe a fantasy novel perspective, where yes, call myself like a fan of world building. I like the lore, the interesting magic systems, the culture, the history of the world. And this takes place in the Old West. It takes place in America. Generally know the story and the people, and it's not that new, but is one of those, not wearing this on purpose, but like a Sanderson quote, journey before destination. That's what this book felt like. It felt like a long travel journey because our characters, our crew, they're just on this cattle drive from Texas up into Montana and all the things they experience on the way. And it has that kind of party dynamic that you find in a fantasy novel, maybe to call back to the classics that I read, sort of like a Lord of the Rings, in the sense that it's just a journey. They're on a quest. It's not to destroy the One Ring, but it is to sell some cattle. But along the way, we just get more endeared to the characters. And the book really picks off that it does have a slow start, but if you can push through that initial setup kind of period where we're just sort of learning about the characters and getting eased into the world. Once the cattle drive starts, I thought it didn't necessarily pick up, but it got more immersive, and I was just into the story and just into the characters. There was something about the characters. It's hard to really describe other than just I became endeared to the characters. They all felt very three-dimensional. No one felt like a caricature, which again sometimes happens in fantasy and sci-fi, where you have the always like the good character, the bad character, where they're just representing sort of one dimension, but all the characters felt very well rounded, well written, and surprisingly for the time, even the female characters that are even like side characters. So the women in the story, even there's a couple sort of main female characters that, of course, get really fleshed out and were really well treated. But there's also just the small characters we meet along the way that work in like the brothels to say exactly what happens. It's yeah, they even felt real. So it was very interesting character work throughout the series, but throughout the novel that everyone does feel real, feel three dimensional. It was just a well written series. There's really not a lot more to say. I guess maybe like a trigger warning sort of. This is in the Old West, so there is a lot of sort of talk of things like brothels and drinking, and there's a little bit of like violence because I guess that was the time period. So it's not necessarily pull any punches of some of the stuff that happens. So it does, on the flip side of that, as sort of a trigger warning, but also on the like, I don't say positive, but it just paints a really vivid and real picture that nothing's really sugarcoated. That this felt like, yeah, that is how it was during this time period in the Old West on the frontier, driving cattle through the wilderness and just trying to survive as a company, but then finding that camaraderie, that community in the cattle company and the relationships between the characters. So if you're into character driven work, I think, yeah, Lonesome Dove hits all those notes. If you like that travel log, travel journey before destination in your fantasy or sci-fi, then this is absolutely a solid recommendation for you because it is all character work and the characters are just so great, so lovable, not lovable, lovable, but just felt real. I mean, some of them, yes, lovable. I did felt endeared to a lot of the characters, and I thought it was just such a well-written story. Yeah, by the end of it, it is sort of heartbreaking at the end. Everyone gets a conclusion. It does, maybe by other story standards, feels like it drags on, but it has that, again, if you like trilogues, it felt like almost like an epilogue because everyone gets a resolution to their storyline. All the characters do wrap up. It does kind of drag, not drag on, but just it ends and everyone gets a conclusion to their own story. So I do give it props either for positive or negative that it does kind of go the distance and resolve everything with our characters with that main cattle company. So character work, you're gonna love it. If you're craving more sort of action, well, there's like slight little action, but it is 100% character work. Even though, as I said, someone who likes world building and the mythology, I thought it was interesting, and it was. I see why it's so well received and well loved. And on that note, I say, yeah, for fans of fantasy and sci-fi, I think you should still check out Lonesome Dove. It deserves all the praise that it gets online, and I'm glad, I guess, to see that something, is sort of getting me outside of my shell of this world of fantasy sci-fi, and I should try some other stuff. I did read East of Eden this year as well, so going to 2026 or whenever this gets posted, if it gets posted in 26, yeah, I'll look to sort of expand my horizons a little more and maybe branch out to some other genres. So do check out the new, especially the new 40th anniversary edition of Lonesome Dove. Do get the Will Patton narrated 40th anniversary edition. I thought it was really well done from the narration, the production standpoint of the audiobook, and it is worth your Audible credit. Or if you're like me and can find it at your local library, do check it out. So thanks for watching this review and thoughts and feelings on Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. Hope you have a great one, and thanks for watching. See ya.